Hi, I'm Ben Sant. Welcome to this week's episode of Equip Tips. We have a special guest today, you might recall from Season 1 of Frame, Zuzanna Audette, and she's here to talk to us a little about metering. Metering is one of those subjects and concepts that we sometimes have a hard time understanding. I know I've never really used a light meter or an incident meter. It's just kind of, let's use the digital crutch and see what it looks like and hope we get it right. So I'm going to give you the fabled lab coat of wonder.
All right.
This might be a little big for you.
That's all right. Better big than too small.
There we go. It's almost like a Snuggie, isn't it? Yeah.
All right. I feel very professional now. Ready to talk some
You look good in it.
techniques with exposure meters.
So when we're starting out and we want to set an exposure properly, what do I set first? Am I going to set the shutter first, the aperture first, or the ISO first? Because we all know they're like a triangle and they all play on each other.
Yeah.
What do we start with when we're trying to expose for something?
Okay. So our three exposure settings, the ISO, which is going to be the sensitivity to light of your image sensor or your film sensitivity for those of you shooting film. The shutter speed is the length of time you're going to allow light to enter through the lens.
Shutter curtains.
Yes, onto the image sensor or the film plane. And then the aperture, which is measured in numbers called f-stops, which is a measurement of the focal length of the lens divided by the diameter in the opening. That's why it's written f/ and then the number.
That's how big the hole is, right?
Yes.
It's like the iris is on, like our pupils constrict and open.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like what an aperture is,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
So all three of these settings are interrelated, meaning that they're all going to affect the way that light is being registered and recorded by the camera. But they do change the way that the image is going to be taken depending on which settings you sort of prioritize your exposure on. I always set ISO first.
Okay.
And for those of you shooting film, well, what film speed are you going to put into your camera?
Because
It's the
ISO
same-
for digitals comes from the derivative of what the sensitivity
Yes.
of what film we used to use.
Digital camera manufacturers adopted the same sensitivity scale to digital cameras so that film photographers could make the transition much more easily to digital. Now, you always want to set your ISO first and set it depending on the amount of sort of available light you have to utilize for your photograph. And I personally wouldn't recommend using anything other than your lowest ISO, and then maybe around like 400 if you are shooting either indoors during the day or outdoors when it's overcast, and you might just need a little bit more sensitivity.
A little bump.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever gone over 400.
I never have either
And
myself.
if I have to shoot, and I say, I'm a benevolent soccer mom that's shooting my lovely son's, kindergarten program, and they say no flash photography, so we're in this dark room with like these, HMI power lights above. That situation, you're probably gonna have to bump it up to 1600, and use those crutches of digital noise reducers and stuff in Photoshop and that to reduce that. But anytime for normal shooting circumstances, anytime you're applying artificial lighting yourself, I don't think I ever go over 400.
I mean, obviously, there are times when, yes, a higher ISO is sort of the only way to go, especially if you don't have a tripod, you can't extend your shutter, you don't want blur in a low lighting scenario. But do try as much as possible to always set your ISO to the lowest you can possibly have it within a given
low
lighting scenario.
You get that? Low ISO. Where should we begin when we're starting to meter something?
Well, first off, I think we need to kind of start with addressing that there are two different types of meters available to use. The first is reflective meters, which are the type of meters that are embedded within cameras.
That's our little dash lines in our viewfinder, right?
That is the meter in terms of those little dash lines are going to help you decide which settings to use within, a given scenario. Now, not all cameras have reflective meters in them. Medium format cameras and large format cameras oftentimes do not, and you'll see photographers shooting with medium and large format using handheld meters. And handheld meters can either be incident or reflective.
Okay.
So reflective meters read the light that is being reflected off of a subject. Incident meters read the light that is falling onto a subject. Now, the main difference between that is a reflective meter, whatever you point it to, is going to give you a reading to make that medium gray, if we were imagining it within a grayscale. So that can be problematic if you're shooting a white subject matter, a black subject matter, or skin tones, because skin tones obviously vary. We're not all sort of medium gray. Most of us are not probably medium gray.
So if you're really pale, it's going to want to make it a lot darker, right? Because it wants to mix everything into that 18% gray number, and so that would make you look underexposed.
Yes. So if you're using the meter within your camera, shooting people, yes, you can end up having a lot of strange variations within skin tone unless you sort of know how to work around that and can recognize that.
And we want consistency, right?
Exactly.
No guessing games.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, a lot of, studio photographers or portrait photographers will use incident meters because they'll be able to get that accurate light reading in one go. They don't necessarily have to take into consideration then skin tones or the color of the subject matter.
So that light's literally coming onto the subject, and it's going to fall onto the subject, and this meter, this incident meter, is going to read that light that is on that face and give you a proper exposure for that surface that it's hitting.
Yes, because it's actually reading the power of the light rather than what's being reflected off of us. So for example, like I'm wearing, if we did a reflective meter reading off of this white lab coat and then a reflective meter reading off of your shirt, we're going to get two different exposure readings. But really, we don't want two different exposure readings. We want to get a proper exposure to have us properly exposed. We want to see the white lab coat white, your shirt sort of sagey green, our skin approximately palish.
Yeah, we don't want to look like an alien. We don't want to be green. We don't want to be too dark.
Yes.
We want that nice, healthy skin tone. And I think a lot of us have that issue. We'll take a photo and we'll get into post-production and the skin tones don't look right. And so we're using the crutches of, Camera Raw or Lightroom, whatever you might be using, to try to adjust that and try to make it look right. And it's so hard not to just get it right in the camera the first time.
Yeah. And I mean, another issue, though, with skin tones, too, is color, especially when it comes to digital, and that's another segment. Going back to the two different types of exposure meters. So the reflective meters are the most commonly used because they are built into most cameras. Now, certain cameras like medium format cameras and large format cameras will not have reflective meters built into them. Then the photographers will need to use a handheld meter, or sometimes you can get what's called a prism finder. I don't know if you've ever heard of.
That sounds really geeky, and I love that. A prism finder. Is that like the stick that I can hold with two hands to find a proper exposure? I mean,
no, not at all. A prism finder, a lot of medium and large format cameras, the image also ends up inverted when you're looking at it on the ground glass or through your lens.
Just like our retinas, the image is flipped upside down.
Exactly, but we actually see it upside down in a medium format or a large format camera. So what a prism finder does, and prism finders are usually for medium format cameras, it's an attachment that allows you to actually have through the lens viewing on a medium format camera like you have on an SLR, where then you have an eyepiece that you're looking through and the image then is
flipped right
side up for you, and it has a meter within it sometimes if you get a really fancy prism finder.
So back in the day, meter. I'm assuming that photographers had to look at stuff upside down and compose upside down.
Oh yeah, I look at stuff upside down all the time when I shoot with my medium format and large format cameras.
So is there any way we could invent something? Say like we didn't have this enchanted prism finder. It sounds like some type of like witchcraft, this thing.
Well, but it's the exact same sort of double mirror system that's built into your SLR. Kind of utilizing either reflective or incident meters depending on what you've got available.
And most of us probably have a reflective, right? In any late model DSLR, we have that available to us.
And that is the type of meter that's also within the little point and shoot cameras. Although a lot of these are fully automatic in terms of presets, they are coming out with a lot of models now that do have manual controls, meaning you change your aperture, your shutter, and your ISO for each shot.
Programmed auto.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
The P mode.
But the type of meter that's reading the light in these is also a reflective meter. Okay. Whatever you're pointing the camera towards, it's reading the light coming off of that, not the light falling onto it. So, particularly talking about shooting either white subject matter in terms of still life, I'm sure a lot of you have seen like product shots, like a white object taken on a white backdrop.
Yeah, high key image, histograms are going to be to the right.
Yes.
I mean, what do we do? Like, what if I'm shooting a bride in a wedding dress and, it's daylight? I mean, how do we get that right to where the skin tones are right. Because if we meter off the dress, she's obviously going to look way too dark.
Yes, and the dress is going to look dark. The dress is going to look kind of gray and
nasty.
Yeah, not that beautiful sort of pristine white.
Yeah, too many. Brides probably don't like gray dresses.
So this is an 8x10, 18% gray card. A lot of photographers that shoot with reflective meters use these cards in order to get an accurate reading of the lighting. This is going to give you the same type of reading as using an incident meter that would be reflecting the light falling onto the subject. If you kind of squint your eyes and look at Ben holding the card, you can now see that, yeah, his skin tone is not medium gray. And his shirt's not quite medium gray either. So if we had taken a reading off of either his shirt or his skin, it wouldn't have actually been a truly accurate exposure reading. But if we use this card, we'll be able to get an accurate reading.
There's a lot of questions from you out there where we talk about metering mode, those 3 switches on the back of your camera. And what metering mode do we use for what circumstances? We have full weighted, or Nikon calls it matrix metering, where the camera, the reflective meter built in your camera, will actually meter the whole frame. It'll actually take a reading from the entire frame, from every focal point on that sensor. And then we have what we call center weighted medium, where the metering is actually going to focus right on the center of the frame. So in your viewfinder, right in the middle, it's going to focus right there and meter off that, as well as have some gray area around the sides. Think of it as if you're in Photoshop and you have a really soft brush with a lot of feather. That's kind of what center weighted metering does. Now, last but not least, we have spot metering, where we actually can set the point, right, Zoo? Kind of set the spot where we want to meter from. And so if we're working in a situation where we have a lot of mixed light, say a sunset, and we have, you know, a really bright sun and a subject that is pretty much underexposed, we can kind of use spot metering and set that point to meter where we want it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the other spot metering, I want to say, if you set it to spot, it's going to read about an 8% area to give you a light reading. Center weighted, I think it's about a 14% area approximately. And then yes, the evaluative or matrix will take into account all of the lights and then give you an averaged reading. So
it's like
the evaluative,
it's like taking everything and mixing it together on evaluative.
So if you have a mixed lighting scenario, such as Ben described with like really bright backlighting, sunset, etc., you do not want to use that evaluative matrix, or you're going to get a sort of washed out, strange looking photo. You definitely then would want to use center weighted or spot. Yeah.
I know with me, I use, as a portrait photographer, I use center weighted and spot metering myself.
Yes.
I don't think I've had it on matrix since I've owned my camera, unless I'm shooting the landscape or something like that. I'm always, you know, spot metering and moving it right to where I want it and watching that reflective meter, those hash marks there, and adjusting my exposure as needed. I use it a lot when I'm taking that ambient reading, where I'm doing that strobus or lighting approach, where I want to underexpose my background by 2 stops and fill in with my flash. And so, yeah, it's a nice tool to have built into the camera, though.
It definitely is.
And it comes with it. You don't have to pay for it.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually go ahead and take a reading off of the gray card. I'm also then going to take a reflective meter reading off of Ben's shirt to see how different it reads it. And then I'll also do an incident meter reading off of the light to see if it's actually giving us an accurate reading when using the gray card.
We're going to use both types of metering here. We're going to do a reflective metering, and then we're going to use the incident meter here.
Yeah.
It's like a wand. Like if I was a warlock, I'd probably use this as a weapon.
I do have to say, I feel like kind of cool when I pull that out. Yeah.
It does make you look cooler, I'll be honest. I wish I had one.
All right, so go ahead and hold that card up. Now, I've got my ISO set at 100. We're indoors, but we've got a lot of nice photographic light on Ben right now.
So I've got the studio lights are on me right now. Mm-hmm. The light is falling onto this card, and it's going to reflect into the camera's meter.
Yes.
All right.
And I'm doing the spot. Now, it's giving me a reading at an f-stop of 4.5, which is the largest available aperture opening on this particular lens. At ISO 100, it's giving me a shutter of a 1/30th of a second. Now let's see what we get if we use the incident meter. Now I have to make sure that my ISO is set the same. So the incident reading I got, reading the light falling onto Ben, ISO 100, 30th of a second, f4.
Wow.
And this was f4.5, 30th of a
pretty
second
close.
at ISO
Pretty close.
100. Mm-hmm.
So they're both pretty valuable tools. Say like I can't afford one of those yet. You know, I'm on a ramen noodle month. You know, I can't go get that hamburger. What do I need to get an incident meter right away? $5 gray card. And
this will definitely help. But like I said, you actually don't need anything. What you really need to remember is that the reflective meter in your camera, no matter what you point it to take that reading, it's going to give you the reading to make that subject medium gray. So really try to just remember that and try to imagine if you were looking at the scene, whatever you're shooting, in sort of grayscale, what would be medium gray? Take your exposure reading off of that. We use light ratios a lot of times in terms of building up light, like background,
sculpting our light,
exactly,
you know,
with our modeling, and but you can also use it just kind of basics in relations to using your reflective meter with difficult subject matter. Let's say that you are shooting a white subject. One of the first assignments I had when I was a student many, many years ago, when I was learning how to shoot 4x5, was to shoot toilet paper, white toilet paper.
Toilet paper.
Yes.
You shot toilet paper.
Oh yeah, lots of it. Now here's the thing. So if you're using a reflective meter and we took that reading, well, that's going to give us that white toilet paper to be medium gray. With light ratios, if we want medium gray between white, is going to be a 2-stop difference. So all we need to know that if we're going to take a reflective meter reading off of a white subject and we actually want that white subject to be white, overexpose from your meter reading by 2 stops.
Because the meter's going to want us to tone it down,
yes,
because it thinks,
it's gonna wanna make it
I'm white,
medium gray.
I'm way too bright.
Uh-huh.
And we don't want to be too bright. So our camera, you know, the meters, regardless of what is in the frame, wants to mix everything and make everything in that scene 18% gray.
Not everything in the scene, but whatever you're taking the reading on.
Whatever it's metering, whether it be evaluative or matrix, center weighted or spot, it's going to want to mix that to gray or turn that to the value of that 18% gray.
Yes.
And so
Yes,
we
in
got to use a little bit of trickery
Yeah.
to try to make whites look white.
Yes. So just kind of a good rule of thumb to remember. Whatever you point your reflective meter, so the meter in your camera to, it's going to give you a reading for exposure to make that medium gray. So if it is a white subject, overexposed by 2 stops. If it's a black subject, underexposed by 2 stops. Now with skin tones, well, we have more variations, so it's going to vary. But if you are shooting someone who's more on the pale side, I would say general rule of thumb, at least overexpose 1 to 2 stops. If someone's darker in skin tone, underexpose 1 to 3 stops, depending on how dark their skin is.
So that's easy to remember. Darker,
gray color.
under, wider, higher. Lighter? That makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I just also wanted to very briefly mention that, you know, the exposure meter in your camera is going to give you the sort of default reading to create a medium gray tone within your subject matter.
It's like a safety. It's
Yeah.
a safe zone.
I do think everyone needs to learn how to properly use their exposure meters to get quote-unquote default proper exposure. But then there's also obviously, you know, your imagination and creativity to take into account. Depending on what the story of your image is or the purpose of the photo, well, you might want to overexpose purposely or underexpose purposely.
Yeah, there's no rules. The photography.
Yeah,
I
break
mean,
all the rules.
Or imagine, I consider them, you know, it's a guideline. It's a guideline that will help us out in our journey as photographers. It's going to help us so we're not, say like we are shooting something, we're not sure what's wrong. This will help us to where we can get to that default place. But I'm one of those guys, I tend to overexpose my model's faces a little bit. I like the look, and I can have someone come and say, well, that's way overexposed. But, you know, that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
And so
I do that a lot too. You know, it's very kind of popular with like beauty shots or glamour shots to do what's called high-key photography. High-key photography, well, and one thing I do actually want to point out though with high-key and low-key, there is a difference between high-key, low-key, and over and underexposed images. Because a high-key photo, you are prioritizing for the brighter tones within the photograph. If you see the histogram, we tend to see it kind of arch up and more pixel information towards the brighter side of the scale, but we still have pure black in a high key image, where a traditional overexposed photo, you lose your true black. You have to then bring that back, usually in post.
So like in a high key image, we're talking more about the actual tones in the image versus the exposure the camera recorded them with.
With high key, to get a traditional high key, it is a lot about the lighting that you're utilizing. Oftentimes a white background, subject matter is usually wearing light colored clothing, and then the lighting is created in a way to eliminate or lessen shadows, to where there almost is no shadows at all.
So yeah, very, very bright light, beauty dish stuff. We're talking on-axis lighting, a lot of it.
So it's like the image isn't actually overexposed, it's just the lighting's very bright, high key. In a low key image, it's not underexposed, it's just that the lighting is very sort of dark, deep. We kind of work on those shadows and just find these little highlights throughout the image.
And we can use this to show artistic vision, right? If we want,
of course,
you know, if I'm shooting like some zombies or something,
you definitely want low key for sure.
Low key image, you know, and
your traditional sort of beauty shot.
Yeah, the beauty shot, or like I'm shooting some perfume ad, like for, you know, Esteban for men, a new fragrance from so and so. You know, we could go with the high key image.
From the crew of Framed.
From the crew of Framed.
Your own fragrance.
You know, that would be pretty cool, because I buy my cologne at a gas station.
Cool. Well, by the way, what's really fantastic too is you can get handheld meters that are incident and reflective. This is actually an incident and a reflective meter, because I shoot a lot of environmental spaces, and so I like to be able to also use a reflective meter to almost do my own matrix evaluative metering in environmental spaces. That way I could take like a reading from the back wall and a reading from over there, and then kind of decide where I might want to prioritize.
And that way, because if you're in incident mode, you'd have to like run over there.
Oh yeah,
and you don't have time
to.
You know, you're making the mad dash for each corner. Zuzanna, thank you so much for coming out for this week's of Equip Tips. We've learned a lot about metering. We've shared a lot.
I hope so.
I think I'm going to go out and get an incident meter as soon as I can do another ramen noodle month, and they have a sale at the canned food store.
There you go.
So
maybe next month's giveaway, Saconic. Come on, people.
Saconic? I like it. I like it. I'm Big Ben with Equip Tips. Check us out next week, where we're going to be sharing, inspiring, and learning.